Sometimes the things that save our lives are the very things we almost ignore. At 1:17 a.m., the wind moved through the pine trees surrounding the old house, with a sound like distant whispers drifting across the mountains. The property sat alone at the end of a narrow gravel road outside Black Mountain, North Carolina, hidden beneath a blanket of fog and moonlight. Most people in town avoided the place after dark. Some claimed the house brought bad luck. Others simply refused to explain why they never drove past it anymore. Inside, Thomas Reed stood barefoot on weathered floorboards, staring through the darkness toward the living room window. The house was silent except for the ticking of an old wall clock and the occasional creak of settling wood. Then Duke barked, once, sharp, sudden. Not the casual bark of a dog hearing a squirrel outside. This was different. Thomas felt it instantly. During his years with the Army's K-9 unit, deployed to Afghanistan from 2010 to 2012 on search operations, he had learned to trust certain sounds. Duke's warning bark was one of them. The German Shepherd stood near the fireplace, muscles tense beneath his black and tan coat. His amber eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. Another bark followed, then another. Thomas slowly set down the coffee mug he had been holding. The old house smelled faintly of cedar wood, dust, and fresh paint from repairs he had started earlier that week. Only 3 days had passed since he inherited the property, and nothing about it felt normal. Duke moved forward, ears high, body rigid. His gaze never left the window. Thomas stepped closer and looked outside. At first he saw nothing except moonlit fog drifting across the overgrown yard. The ancient oak trees stood motionless, their branches twisting against the night sky like black veins. Then something caught his attention. A faint movement near the tree line. Just for a second. A shadow where no shadow should have been. Thomas narrowed his eyes. The figure disappeared almost immediately. Maybe it had been a trick of the fog. Maybe not. Duke growled softly. The low sound rolled from deep within his chest. Thomas had heard that growl before. In the mountains of Kandahar, in the rubble of compounds where danger didn't announce itself, where instinct often mattered more than certainty. "Easy, boy," he whispered. But Duke did not relax. Instead, he walked toward the front door and stared directly at it. The dog's posture changed, alert, focused, waiting. Thomas crossed the room and reached for the flashlight, resting on a nearby table. Outside, the temperature had fallen into the low 40s. A cold draft slipped through the old windows. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called from the forest. Thomas opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards groaned beneath his weight. For a moment, his breath caught. The sound reminded him of IED tripwires in Afghan villages. That creak before everything changed. He forced the memory down and swept the flashlight across the yard. The beam passed over the trees, the fence line, and an abandoned tool shed leaning slightly to one side. Nothing, no movement, no person, no explanation. Then Duke suddenly turned and faced the house itself. He barked again, this time louder, more urgent. Thomas followed his gaze. The dog was no longer looking toward the woods. He was staring at the old house, at one specific section of the wall near the living room. The same place Duke had sniffed repeatedly since they arrived. The same place Thomas had dismissed as old wood and dust. A chill crept across the back of his neck, because for the first time he realized Duke might not be warning him about someone outside. The dog might be trying to tell him something, was hidden inside the house itself. 36 hours earlier, rain drifted across the streets of Asheville in thin silver lines, turning the pavement into mirrors of yellow streetlights and passing headlights. Thomas Reed sat behind the wheel of his aging Ford Expedition, parked beside an empty warehouse lot near the river. The heater had stopped working months ago. A folded army blanket covered his legs while Duke slept curled in the passenger seat. The digital clock on the dashboard read 10:43 p.m. Thomas rubbed his hands together and glanced at the fuel gauge. Less than a quarter tank remained. "We have had better weeks, buddy," he said quietly. Duke opened one eye and thumped his tail once against the seat. Thomas smiled faintly. "At least one of us is still optimistic." His stomach growled. Dinner had been a gas station sandwich nearly 8 hours earlier. He reached into the center console and pulled out a folded receipt. Written on the back were numbers he had been trying not to think about. $27.84. That was everything left in his checking account. Some nights, sitting in the cold truck, Thomas wondered if this was what giving up felt like. Not dramatically, but quietly. Parking his life in the dark and waiting for morning that never quite came. Duke suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the windshield. A woman in her 60s wearing a navy raincoat stood beside the vehicle. She tapped gently on the glass. Thomas lowered the window halfway, Cold air rushed inside. "Mr. Reed?" she asked. "That depends who's asking." The woman offered a polite smile. "My name is Amelia Brooks. I have been trying to reach you all day." Thomas frowned. "Lawyer?" "Attorney." Usually, not a good sign. "Not always." She glanced toward Duke. "May I speak with you for a moment?" 10 minutes later, they sat inside a small diner across the street. The smell of coffee and fresh pie filled the room. Duke rested beside the booth, watching every movement around them. Amelia opened a leather folder and slid a document across the table. "Do you remember Evelyn Parker?" Thomas stared at the name. At first, nothing came to mind. Then a memory surfaced, a winter shelter. A silver-haired woman struggling to carry groceries through an ice storm, her thin coat offering little protection against the wind. Thomas had been volunteering there, helping where he could, doing small jobs to earn a meal. She had fallen on black ice. He had helped her up. "The lady with the blue scarf," he said. Amelia nodded. That would be her. "She passed away?" "3 months ago." Silence settled between them. Thomas remembered her eyes, kind but with something deeper, something knowing. He had seen her several times after that winter. Once at a community center when he was helping fix a leaking roof. Once at a farmer's market. Each time she had greeted him as if they shared some unspoken understanding. "I am sorry to hear that," he said. Amelia folded her hands. "Mr. Reed, Miss Parker left specific instructions in her will. She wanted you to receive her property." Thomas blinked. "I think you have the wrong person." "I do not. I helped her carry groceries one night." "You helped her many times, over many years. According to her journal, you just never realized she was keeping track." Amelia pushed a paper toward him. "The deed is legally yours." "What kind of property?" "A house outside Black Mountain. It has been in her family for decades." Thomas laughed softly, not because it was funny, because it sounded impossible. "You are serious?" "Very." Duke suddenly sat upright beneath the table. Amelia noticed. "Interesting dog." Thomas reached down and scratched behind Duke's ear. "He is family." Amelia smiled. "Miss Parker mentioned him specifically." "Duke?" "Yes." Thomas stared. "Why?" Amelia hesitated. "Because according to her notes, she believed your dog would understand the house before anyone else." She closed the folder. "There is one more thing. Nobody in town has wanted that property for years." Thomas frowned. "Why not?" "That," Amelia said quietly, "is exactly what you are about to find out." The house stood exactly as Thomas had imagined it, old, weathered, and somehow lonely. The keys felt heavy in his hand when he turned them in the lock. Inside, dust particles danced in the afternoon light. Furniture remained under white sheets like ghosts. The air smelled of age and secrets. Duke moved through the room silently, sniffing at corners, at walls, at a particular section near the living room hearth. He returned to that spot again and again, his nose working, his ears alert. Thomas watched him, remembering how Duke had worked in the valleys near Kandahar, how the dog could sense things, tripwires, hidden explosives, danger that lived in the earth itself. That night, alone in the house with only Duke for company, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the old structure settle around him. Twice he jerked awake, convinced he was back in the compound, his heart racing, his hand reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. Duke had pressed against him both times, grounding him, reminding him where he actually was. The house was a mercy and a curse, a place to belong that somehow felt dangerous. Thomas understood why people avoided it. On the second morning, while examining the fireplace, Thomas noticed what Duke had known all along. The wall behind the hearth held a seam, barely visible, but there, a loose brick. Behind it, a hidden compartment, and inside that compartment, a lever. The section of floor beneath the rug revealed a trapdoor. The stairs descended into darkness. Thomas took a flashlight and Duke followed, never hesitating. Below, they found an underground chamber, shelves lined with preserved documents, crates filled with records sealed in waterproof containers, maps dating back decades, survey reports, ledgers filled with careful handwriting. Thomas carefully removed an envelope from the lockbox and stared at his own name for several long seconds. The handwriting looked old, written years before Evelyn Parker had ever passed away. Duke sat quietly beside him, watching. "I do not think this is a coincidence anymore," Thomas whispered. He opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The paper crackled softly in the underground silence. "Thomas Reed, if you are reading this, then Duke has done exactly what I hoped he would do." I know you feel as though the world forgot you. I know you believe you have nothing left to offer. But I have watched you for 15 years. Watched you help people when you were hurting yourself. Watched your dog stay loyal when life became difficult. Watched you move through this town like a ghost, seeking permission to exist. You do not understand why I chose you, but your dog does. He has always known. Trust what you find here. Not everyone who comes looking deserves the truth. You will know the difference. The world needs more guardians than owners. Evelyn. Thomas lowered the page. His hands trembled slightly. She knew, he whispered. At that moment, his phone vibrated. Amelia Brooks. He answered immediately. Thomas, where are you? Under the property. Silence followed. I am sorry, what? Long story. What did you find? Amelia exhaled. Property records, old county archives, and something else. Victor Hale's family tried to purchase this land for almost 20 years. Every offer was rejected. The property never belonged to the house itself. It belonged to what was hidden beneath it. Thomas slowly looked around the underground chamber. Shelves, crates, ledgers, history. I think I am standing inside the answer. Together with Amelia's guidance, Thomas and Duke began examining the contents more carefully. Most of the crates contained records preserved with meticulous care, maps, survey reports, historical documents, ledgers filled with decades of notations. Then Thomas opened one particular ledger and immediately understood why Victor had become obsessed. The records detailed ownership of thousands of acres throughout the surrounding mountains dating back nearly 80 years, mineral rights, water rights, conservation agreements, assets that had quietly increased in value for decades, land that held the future of an entire community. How bad is it? Amelia asked when he called back. Thomas laughed softly in disbelief. Not bad, just bigger than I expected. A car engine suddenly echoed from above. Duke immediately stood. His ears snapped toward the staircase. The dog began to move toward the stairs, then stopped. He looked back at Thomas, waiting. Not leading. Watching. They climbed back to the surface. By the time they emerged, Victor Hale stood near the hatch. He wore an expensive suit that seemed wrong against the weathered property. His face was lined with something that looked like regret. You found it, Victor said quietly. Thomas stepped forward. You knew about this place the entire time. Victor nodded once. My grandfather helped create those records. Decades ago, he believed certain people should control the land, should profit from its resources. Victor's jaw tightened. Evelyn was supposed to marry him. Instead, she chose a different path, a better one. And she never gave them to you, Thomas said. No. For the first time, Victor seemed exhausted rather than confident. She believed that if I controlled the resources, I would become the same man my grandfather was, that I would use them to control people rather than help them. Victor looked toward the mountains. Perhaps she was right. Thomas glanced toward Duke. The dog stood calmly beside him, his presence somehow settling the moment. Victor followed his gaze. Remarkable animal. He is the reason I found any of this. Victor smiled sadly. Then perhaps she understood something I never could. He turned to leave, then paused. Take care of those records, Thomas. Use them better than we would have. The mountain wind moved through the pines as silence settled between them. For the first time since arriving, Thomas realized the mystery was no longer about hidden records or forgotten property. It was about why Evelyn Parker had chosen a man with almost nothing, a man broken by war and circumstance, to become the guardian of something that could change the future of an entire community. 3 months later, spring arrived gently across the mountains. Dogwoods bloomed along the winding roads, and the old property no longer looked forgotten. Fresh paint covered the weathered siding. The porch had been repaired. Flower beds, once buried beneath weeds, now stretched across the front yard in bright rows of color. Thomas sat in a wooden chair beneath the morning sun, while Duke rested beside him. The German Shepherd had claimed the porch as his official post and seemed perfectly content supervising every visitor who arrived. There had been many lately, families, local historians, conservation groups, people interested in the records hidden beneath the property and the opportunities they created for the surrounding community. The discovery had changed more than Thomas expected. With Amelia's help, the documents were authenticated and preserved. Several long-forgotten agreements protecting local water sources and public land were restored. Community projects received funding. Small businesses benefited. The value was significant, but the true impact reached much farther than money. One afternoon, Amelia arrived carrying a small box. I thought you might want this, she said. Thomas opened it carefully. Inside rested a photograph. Evelyn Parker stood in her garden, smiling beside a much younger Duke. Thomas stared at the image for a long moment. "When was this taken?" he asked. Amelia smiled. "About 4 years ago. According to her journal, Duke wandered into her yard while you were repairing a neighbor's fence down the road. She had been watching for you both for quite some time." Thomas laughed softly. "That sounds like him." Amelia sat beside him. "There is something else." She handed him a folded page. Thomas recognized the handwriting immediately. Evelyn's careful script. He unfolded the note and read quietly. "If you are reading this, then the house finally belongs to someone who understands that value is not measured by what we keep, but by what we choose to protect. I watched you help people when nobody was watching. I watched your dog stay loyal when life became difficult. I watched a man who had lost everything still reach out to help a stranger in an ice storm. That is when I knew. The world needs more guardians than owners. It always has." Thomas lowered the paper slowly. For several moments, neither he nor Amelia spoke. Finally, she asked, "What are you going to do now?" Thomas looked across the property. The mountains rolled into the distance beneath a sky of endless blue. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a man searching for somewhere to belong. He was already home. "I think I stay," he said quietly. Amelia smiled. "Good answer." Later that evening, after everyone had gone, Thomas sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The setting sun painted the hills gold. Duke lay nearby, watching the horizon. The dog's breathing was steady, peaceful, content. "You know," Thomas said, scratching behind the dog's ears, "none of this happens without you." Duke responded with a single tail thump. "That is what I thought." The wind moved gently through the pines. Somewhere beyond the trees, church bells echoed faintly across the valley. Thomas leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. Not because he was tired, because he was grateful. Years earlier, he had lost almost everything and believed the world had forgotten him. He had slept in his truck in parking lots. He had counted pennies. He had convinced himself that the best he could hope for was survival, not belonging. He had carried the weight of Afghanistan like a stone in his chest, certain that trauma had marked him as broken beyond repair. Yet somehow kindness had found its way back, not as a fortune, not as a miracle falling from the sky, but as a home, a purpose, and a faithful friend who never stopped believing there was something worth finding in a man the world had discarded. And as the last light faded across the mountains, Thomas Reed finally understood what Evelyn had known all along. Sometimes the greatest treasures are not hidden beneath the ground. Sometimes they are the people and places that remind us we still belong. Sometimes they are the ones who see us when we have forgotten how to see ourselves. Sometimes they are as simple and as profound as a dog's unwavering loyalty and a stranger's quiet faith. Sometimes the things that save our lives are exactly the things we almost ignore. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might enjoy it too. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us your city and country in the comments. More heartfelt and unforgettable hero dog stories are already waiting for you. See you in the next one.